Welcome back to my Morgan three-wheeler workshop series. There are lots of videos in this series, and if you want to get them all in order and look at the ones that apply to you, then please go down just below this screen, click on the subscribe button, and then you'll be able to click on playlists and see them all sorted out so that you can pick the ones you want. This particular video coming up is about the chain drive, and I think I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining to you why I've decided to convert my vehicle to chain drive and why I produce a conversion to fit for other people. In the early days, I thought a lot of the clonking and banging that came from my vehicle when I accelerated was due to the belt jumping over the teeth. Belts do not jump over the teeth. Belt drives are just as strong, if not stronger, and more reliable than chain drives. There are, however, in the Morgan three-wheeler, one or two reasons why you might choose to revert to the old-fashioned but very reliable chain. One of the things that chain has going for it is it's probably the most efficient of all transmission techniques. It runs at about 97% efficiency, and a belt, although it is still quite efficient, is in the lower 90s. Different manufacturers make different claims, obviously, but I think you'll find a belt is about 5% less efficient than a chain. You would think the belt would be a lighter weight option, but unfortunately the problem is that the rear sprocket is such an enormous affair, and the aluminium ones, which were reasonably light, fail very, very soon, and the steel ones, which last a good length of time, are much, much heavier, and obviously being the rear sprocket on the rear wheel, that is unsprung weight, and the chain and its chain sprocket and its carrier are considerably lighter than that rear belt sprocket. Front sprocket is also considerably lighter, but that's less important because that's on the right side of the suspension units. One of the other advantages that comes with chain, although it is possible to do with belt but very, very expensive, and I doubt if you'd be able to get the parts anyway, the other possibility you get with a chain is being able to change the front sprocket and therefore the overall gearing. The belt drive that Morgan have chosen gives you just a tad more than 2-to-1 ratio. My chain drive gives you exactly 2-to-1, very, very little difference from the original belt. You can drop a tooth or put an extra tooth on the front sprocket and change that down to about 1.9 or up to 2.1, slightly less than 2.1 actually, but that is possible. To do that, you've got to take out the bevel box, but it's not the worst job in the world. You can do it in a few hours. The cost is another thing to take into account. If you're someone who's only going to do a fairly low mileage, then there is little point in spending all the money that's required to upgrade an aluminium sprocket on the back wheel to a steel one and fit a new belt, because by the time that aluminium sprocket is worn out, the belt will be worn out too. You will be short of something in the region of 700 quid to replace a steel, or to fit a steel sprocket and a new belt, plus the cost of having it fitted, of course, and fitting a belt means taking out the swinging arm, so it's quite a long job. A chain, on the other hand, will cost you half of that, maybe less, for a complete kit, which includes the front sprocket, which might either be a one-piece sprocket or it might be a two-piece one to make changing if you want to change the gearing at regular intervals to make that easier. And also a rear sprocket and a carrier which bolts on using the same set of bolts that held the old belt pulley on the back wheel, and a new chain. You can fit it without taking the swinging arm out, so a good deal cheaper. You'll get 20,000 miles, maybe only 20,000 miles out of a chain. So if you're someone who doesn't do a huge amount of mileage, then it's a very cost-effective solution. The chain, as I said, is much easier to replace than a belt. To replace a belt, the swinging arms have got to come out. With a chain, you can just break the old chain, put a new chain round, rivet up the links, or put on the spring link if you choose to do that. I choose not to, I choose to rivet them. Sprockets. So chain replacement every 18,000 miles, sprocket replacement every 36,000. If you look after it well, you might get a little bit more. The only thing you have to do in order to look after it, because I fit a sealed chain, the ones I choose are Tsubaki's X-ring chains, top of the market really. The only thing you have to do is put a little bit of oil on it every 300 or 400 miles just to lubricate the rollers on the outside of the chain, which are not sealed. What else? Noise is something that people often talk about. They often ask if the chain is noisier. No, it isn't. One of the problems, or there are two problems with a belt. One of which is that when the teeth on the belt enter the cavity between two teeth on the sprocket, the air that is in there is expelled very rapidly, rather like the noise you get when you clap your hands. That pop is the air being expelled. It's not a very loud noise from the belt, but it happens thousands of times a minute and makes a sort of grey noise in the background, something you probably don't notice, but it's a bit like wind rushing through past your ears when you're driving, so you probably don't notice it, but it is definitely there. The other noise that you get from the belt is where it squeals when it rubs up against the side plates. Now that is quite a problem, and I'll explain that in a minute. A chain, on the other hand, you get a sort of a rustling noise in the background. It certainly isn't any louder than a belt. There's no clanking and whirring or anything. It's really a very bearable background noise. I think the biggest problem, and the one which I think is most important when it comes to changing from belt to chain, is the alignment problem. Chains, because there is clearance between the side plates of the chain and the teeth of the sprocket that fit between them, there is a little bit of clearance in there. Chains will allow a certain amount of out of alignment of the sprockets. Not very much, but if you're a few degrees out, it's okay. None of the chain manufacturers I know will quote any tolerances for out of alignment. They all say, excuse me, get the pulleys as close as you possibly can. They do not give you any tolerance, but there is certainly an amount of allowance in there which you can get away with. What they do tell you is if you see wear on the sides of the sprocket where the plates are rubbing it, then you know that you're too far out of alignment. The belt, on the other hand, is something which is much less tolerant. Let me just show you. I'll use this lovely old wooden yardstick to demonstrate. If that is the belt, and up here I've got the rear sprocket, and my hand down here is the front sprocket, any tiny misalignment of the front sprocket will make that belt track left and right. And if you think about the geometry of this, just 1/10 of a millimetre out here is going to be a millimetre out up here. The difficulty with that is that the rear pulley is quite narrow. It's not much wider than the belt, and so the belt ends up running against the side plates, which is where all that squealing noise comes from. You'll possibly have seen people recommending that you squirt washing up liquid on the belt in order to stop that noise. I don't actually think that's the best solution. The only adjustment you've got in the organ, you have no adjustment on this pulley at the front, the only adjustment you've got in the organ is to be able to move the back wheel. Well, that really isn't much good, because moving the back wheel is the driven sprocket down here, which dictates where the belt goes. And even if the back wheel did move the belt across, I'm sure it does a bit, the front pulley is much wider, and so there is a fair amount of tolerance there, and I suspect that that is done on purpose because the rear wheel has to be aligned, or you've got to try and align the rear wheel with the centre of the vehicle, and so some tolerance is allowed here, and that's not where the noise comes from. You don't get any noise there, you get it back here where the belt is running against those side plates. And the other thing that happens is that in a motor vehicle the belt drive is bi-directional. What that means is that when you're accelerating, the belt is being pulled by the front pulley, and when you're decelerating, when you're on engine braking, it's almost as though you've reversed the pulley and you're running it the other way. The tension in the belt goes into the bottom run instead of the top one. And what you've got there is tension in the top. You take your foot off to slow down, tension in the bottom. And that makes that belt track left and right. I've videoed this, I know it does it. And you'll possibly notice if you've got squealing from your belt, you'll notice it's there on acceleration and goes away on engine braking, or vice versa. So that is possibly, in my mind, the major reason for changing to chain drive, because if you want to get the rear wheel lined up properly, then with a chain you have a little bit of tolerance. You can line the rear wheel up with the vehicle and the chain will still run quietly and smoothly. But the choice is yours. If, like me, you're one of those old-fashioned guys who just thinks chains are nicer, this is for you. Thanks very much for listening. Now I'll see if I can manage to show you how the chain drive conversion goes together. One of the first tasks for the chain conversion is, of course, to remove the sprocket or sprockets which carried the belt drive. There are other videos in my series which will show you how to remove the rear wheel and how to remove the bevel box from the car. Having got that far, get the bevel box on the bench. This flange stops you from holding the sprocket, so remove that. On the nut there are, or shall I say on the shaft, there are two flats, and this little rim that's turned into the nut is hammered down into the two flats in order to prevent it coming undone, a sort of locking device. It's difficult to get behind them with a chisel, but do your best and try and get them back up again. It takes a lot of force to shift this nut, and so put it in the vise, get a good grip on the sprocket. Don't be afraid of damaging the sprocket. It is glass hard. It will damage the jaws of the vise before it damages it. A long extension on the socket T-bar and a lot of welly will get it moving. Takes a lot of shifting to get this thing off. It is a huge nut, a very fine thread, and as you can see, full of Loctite, and also these locking tabs. Better than me. And now, having got the nut off, we have to get the pullers behind the sprocket and pull the sprocket off the shaft. Actually, now that the nut is off, we find that that really isn't the excellent fit on there that I thought it would be. I've had them come off, they're really tight to pull off. This particular one is a very easy fit. But the material is good, the splines are both glass hard, there is no fear that they will wear out or get damaged, but even so I would do as the makers did and tighten that nut up fully. Here we've got all the sprockets ready to do the chain conversion. The front end is fairly straightforward. A plate wheel, alloy steel plate wheel, and a carrier which has got the splines in it to fit onto the bevel box, and that's spigoted together there. And as you can see, it assembles with 4 bolts. The advantage of which is you've got the opportunity to buy a fairly cheap replacement sprocket without having to have the splines cut in it. It does, however, make a slightly less than tidy assembly, and I think at some point in the future I will probably be getting one-piece dished sprockets made. This does also give you the opportunity quite cheaply to have higher and lower gear ratios. This is a 24 tooth sprocket. You can fit a 23 or a 25 or even bigger on there if you want. You can't go smaller because of the boss at the back. So that's the front end. The rear end, similarly, a carrier which has 5 studs in it and a sprocket sits onto the carrier, and the 5 holes in the middle use the same 5 bolts that held your original belt pulley in place. Don't have to put new bolts in, just use the same bolts. The sprocket, you can possibly see, has a dish in one side. It's stepped there. This carrier fits up against the wheel hub and is reversible. You can put it on either way. The sprocket is also reversible. You can put it on either way. Because of the dish in the sprocket and the thickness of this plate, you can have it fitted with the dish towards the carrier on either side, with the carrier around the other way, and that will give you a central position. If you then fit the sprocket, take it off and turn it around, fit it with the dish away from the carrier, that moves the line of the sprocket 4 millimeters to the outboard side of the vehicle. If we put the carrier on the other way round and we put the dish away from the carrier from the inside, then that moves the sprocket 4 millimeters inboard of centre. So it gives us 8 millimeters of adjustment. Should you find that when you've got the sprockets in position and you're trying to line it all up, that you can't quite get it, you can move it. You'll probably find that when I fit them, the dish will be towards the carrier so that it's in the central position, and you can move it 4 millimeters out or 4 millimeters in. Combined with the adjustment that you've got at the front of the swinging arm when you move the trunnions left and right, that should give you more than enough to get perfect alignment of the chain and also to have the wheel on the centre line of the vehicle. Right, so now it's time to address the sticky problem of chain alignment, or belt alignment for that matter. The problem is the same with both. You can see I've got a nice long straight edge, and if I hold that nice long straight edge firmly against the side of the sprocket on the bevel box and just swing it down carefully, I can tell you that that just kisses the side of the rear wheel sprocket, which is exactly what we want. However, when we do the same thing from the back and hold the straight edge firmly on the rear wheel sprocket, we find that it's about 5 millimeters outboard of the front sprocket. Now, if you remember, we have already lined up the wheel with the centre line of the vehicle, so we can't just be moving the back wheel, swinging it left and right. But what we can do, and I'll try and get in close enough for you to see, down there you can see there is just a few millimetres of clearance between the end of the bevel box output shaft and the swinging arm. The first thing I'm going to do is to wind the swinging arm trunnions across and take up some of that free space there. You will notice that in order to make the accessibility better for getting a straight edge alongside those sprockets, I've taken out the near side shock absorber. That is a bit of a pain because it means I've now got to drop the wheel down in order to get the bolt in the bottom, because they won't come out because the petrol tanks are in the way. And by the way, it's no good putting them in the other way round because you can't then get them out because the wheel's in the way. The best answer is to have them in from the outside. So the petrol tanks are what stops you, because you can then just drop the wheel down and pull them out underneath the petrol tank. The next job we're going to do is fitting the chain over the sprockets. I'm using a Tsubaki X-ring chain, Japanese sealed chain. I believe they're amongst the best. And I don't like to use spring clip joining links. We use them on lighter motorcycle applications, but this is a fairly heavy duty application, and so I like to rivet the chain together. You'll see the Tsubaki chain is riveted in a sort of square fashion. I don't know if you can see that. And that riveting is achieved with a punch with a V-shaped groove in the end. And we just rivet that once, turn it 90 degrees and do it again, and it gives you that square pyramid configuration on the head of the rivet. There are plenty of riveting tools on the market for chains. Tsubaki make a specific one for their chain. I've made up one of my own. The only difference with it is I've got a hexagon bolt in there, and you just use that hexagon bolt to clamp the side plate of the joining link onto the rivet heads. Difficult to know how tight to do it up, but Tsubaki show a pair of water pump pliers, so plumber's pliers, to do that up. So no white knuckle stuff, but pretty tight. The problem with the Morgan three-wheeler is that the chain is within the bodywork. It's just below the bodywork. You can see it to work on it, but it's not easy to get at, and it's not somewhere you want to be swinging a hammer. And so my punch fits in through there, goes over the head of the rivet. You give it a thump on the end, and it's long enough to get you outside the edge of the bodywork, so you don't risk putting dents in your bodywork. And that punch, you then just rotate it through 90 degrees, smack it again, do that on both pins, job done. When you're putting it together, the chain comes with little spare X-rings that go inside the link. It comes with grease. Don't forget to grease all the pins and inside the rollers in order to get it greased up before you put the seals on. But otherwise it's fairly simple. When you come to splitting the chain, if you've got too many links, or if you're taking an old chain off, these things will work, but the riveted chains are a bit heavy duty for them. So what I do is grind the heads off the angle grinder first, then put this little device on, and if you can get it wound back far enough, that will then push the link through. But don't try and do it before you've ground the head off, because you'll probably mess up the tool. Right, let's go and put it together. The chain is now installed, everything aligned nicely, chain has been tensioned. Up here you can just get about ½ an inch movement up and down, which is about what we want. Coming around to the front, we can see that the trunnion pins for the swinging arm have been screwed into place, all the slack's been taken out, little half turn to pre-tension the tapered rollers. The stainless steel locking rings or nuts have been replaced with mild steel ones which will not gall up and weld themselves onto the pins or the trunnions. And to make sure nothing goes amiss, the end of the trunnion shaft itself has been wired to the chassis member or the support from the chassis that holds the petrol tank up. The one thing you need to be aware of with these X-ring or O-ring chains is that they are loaded with grease, and so when you first run them, they need to be run for about 10 miles to bed them in, because the grease holds the rollers centrally, and once the chain is in tension and you start using it, those rollers are no longer central, they're all on one side of the pin, or the pin is on one side of the roller, whichever way you like to look at it, and the chain will go slack as that grease moves around. But it's very thick, dense grease. When it's cold, it doesn't move around on its own. Just tensioning the chain up to try and pull it all round is a bit airy-fairy. So the best thing to do is to get it tensioned and then take it out for a spin for about 10 miles, and then you'll find that it needs to be retensioned again. You may even need to retension it again after another 10 miles or so, but probably not. The owner of this vehicle can consider himself quite fortunate, because we've managed to get the wheel on the centre line of the vehicle and both the sprockets within 1 millimetre of being lined up with each other. So we haven't got any of that, or any of that, or any of this business with the wheel not being in the middle. Even more with the belt than with the chain, you have the chance that you will not be able to achieve wheel on the centre line, belt sprockets and chain sprockets both lined up with each other. What I suggest you do under those circumstances is to effectively divide the error by 3. Have a little bit of error on the front sprocket, a little bit of error on the rear sprocket, and a little bit of error on the centre line. The centre line, I suspect, is the one which is less or least important, because if the wheel isn't quite on the centre line, then the vehicle might end up going down the road crabbing slightly, but we're only talking millimetres. No one will notice.